The morning sun had just risen above the horizon of Everton, Ohio, when the alarm clock blared in Rob Freeman's small wooden house at 6:30 a.m. He didn't need to be at the courthouse until 9 o'clock, but decades as a federal prosecutor had taught him the value of preparation. At 65, he was no longer the spry man who once strode with authority through federal courtrooms, but his sharp eyes and slightly trembling hands still carried the steadiness of someone who had brought dangerous criminals to justice. The modest suburban Everton home, where he lived alone, reflected his orderly nature, a workspace with neatly stacked old case files on the desk, a gray wool sweater hung ready on a hook from the night before, and a bookshelf filled with law volumes he occasionally thumbed through. Before diving into the story, comment where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the latest stories. Rob quietly rose from bed, his feet slowly descending the creaking wooden stairs. He opened the curtains, letting pale light flood the simple bedroom that held only a bed and a small table with a photo of his late wife. Today was different from the usual. He wasn't heading to the federal courthouse, where he once commanded respect from lawyers, as an assistant U.S. attorney for the Northern District of Ohio. Instead, he was due at Everton Municipal Court to contest a traffic ticket he believed was wrongly issued. He opted for a simpler outfit than usual, an old but crisp white shirt, a gray wool sweater, and black slacks. Standing before the hallway mirror, he smoothed his thinning white hair, his eyes gleaming with the determination he'd carried since graduating from a prestigious law school and earning his federal prosecutor role. "Let's get in and out quickly," he muttered to himself, his deep voice resonating in the quiet space. He grabbed an apple from a basket on the kitchen table and poured black tea into a scratched metal travel mug, something he preferred over coffee since his high-pressure working days. His faded blue Ford waited in the garage behind the house, a reward he'd given himself after winning a major case years ago. Though old, it remained a point of pride, even if he often noticed surprised glances from passers-by when a black elderly man stepped out of what was once an expensive car. Morning traffic in Everton moved slowly. The narrow roads into downtown were filled with trucks and aging cars, horns honking sporadically. Rob wasn't worried. He'd left early to ensure he'd reach the courthouse by 9 a.m. He turned on the radio, the steady NPR announcer reading news about a new Ohio bill, while his mind rehearsed the traffic ticket details, the conflicting sign photo, the ticket's timestamp, and the concise argument he'd present. To him, it was a minor matter, but he had no idea this trip would unravel a chain of larger events, pulling him back into a fight he thought he'd left behind. As the Ford rolled through Everton's foggy streets, Rob gripped the wheel, eyes fixed ahead. This city, with its aging neighborhoods and scars of past racial divides, was where he'd grown up and chosen to stay after retirement. He didn't know this peaceful morning would soon turn extraordinary, that his meticulous preparation wouldn't just be for a small fine, but for a bigger confrontation with the very system he'd spent his life serving. For Rob Freeman, justice was never to be taken lightly, and today, he'd prove it. When the dashboard clock hit 8:15 a.m., the car's Bluetooth buzzed with an incoming call. Rob glanced at the small screen. The name was Thomas Lee, an old colleague from the Northern District of Ohio U.S. Attorney's Office, someone he'd stayed in touch with, despite retiring. His pulse quickened slightly. A direct call from Thomas at this hour was rarely trivial. He pressed answer, Thomas's deep voice filling the speakers. "Rob, sorry for calling so early. We've hit a snag with the Ohio trafficking case. The defense just filed a last-minute motion that could tank our indictment. I need you to look it over now." Rob tightened his grip on the wheel, the familiar rush from his prosecutor days surging back. The Ohio trafficking case was one of the biggest the office had handled in years, a multi-state ring with dozens of victims, and Rob had agreed to advise informally post-retirement. He replied, calm but firm, "All right, Thomas. What's the deadline?" Thomas sighed over the line. "The judge gave us until noon to respond. I'm emailing you the docs. Can you review and call me back?" "Yes," Rob said curtly, though his mind was already racing with possibilities. He'd planned to park by 8:30 to reach the courthouse on time, but now that shifted. Rob needed to stop and review the documents immediately. This case outweighed a traffic ticket. Scanning around, he spotted a small roadside cafe with an empty lot. He pulled in, parking the Ford under an old oak shade, and grabbed his laptop from the back seat. Hotspotting his phone, he opened Thomas's email. The documents loaded, a lengthy motion with complex legal arguments from the defense to dismiss key evidence. Rob started reading, pen scribbling quick notes in a small notebook, each line etched in his resolute handwriting. Time slipped by faster than he realized. He dissected each point in the motion, jotting down flaws and counter-arguments. His mind worked at a veteran prosecutor's pace, even if his body had slowed with age. When he checked the clock again, his heart skipped. 8:50 a.m. The courthouse was a 10-minute drive, and he knew parking in downtown Everton would take longer. He hurriedly called Thomas back via Bluetooth, his voice steady despite rising tension. "Thomas, I've reviewed the motion. They're trying to toss the evidence on collection procedure, but there's a 2015 precedent we can use to counter. I'll send details after my courthouse errand." Thomas exhaled in relief. "Thanks, Rob. That quick analysis helps a ton. Call me when you're free." Rob nodded, though Thomas couldn't see, then hung up. He shut the laptop, stashed it in his leather briefcase, and stepped out briskly. Walking to the car, he couldn't stop thinking about the critical trafficking case he was tied to. Traffic had thickened, the slow crawl testing his patience. This wasn't the time to lose composure. Rob had never been late to court. It went against his principles. But the trafficking case couldn't be ignored. It affected dozens of victims, and this morning's motion could unravel the prosecution's entire effort. Stepping into Everton Municipal Court, his breath slightly ragged from rushing from the lot, Rob glanced at the hallway clock. 9:10 a.m., 10 minutes late, a first in his prosecutorial career. Right hand on his cane, left clutching the worn leather briefcase stuffed with traffic ticket papers, he strode down the long corridor, his leather shoes tapping evenly on the tile. The old red brick building's air felt heavy, dim fluorescent lights adding to the morning's gloom. Judge Edwin Carter's courtroom sat at the hall's end, its dark wooden door ajar. Rob pushed it open, trying to slip in quietly, but Carter's icy stare locked onto him instantly. Carter, a 62-year-old white man, with salt and pepper hair and thin-rimmed glasses, presided from his bench in a pristine black robe. With over 30 years on the bench, he ran his courtroom like a precise machine, and tardiness, to him, was a personal affront. The room was packed, over 20 people on wooden benches, mostly traffic fines, minor violations, or civil disputes. Carter was mid-case but paused, his voice cutting like a blade. "Come forward." Rob approached the defendant's stand, his pace deliberate but upright, unshaken. He set his briefcase down, hand on his cane, eyes meeting Carter's. The judge skimmed the schedule sheet, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "You must be Robert Freeman, scheduled for 9 a.m. He emphasized the time, eyes narrowing as if setting an example for the room. "Do you think your time is more valuable than this court's, Mr. Freeman?" Before Rob could reply, Carter pressed on, his voice rising like a lecture. "We have rules here. This isn't a marketplace where you show up whenever you please." A few attendees shifted in their seats, sensing the tension. Rob stood still, his left hand calmly opening his briefcase to pull out the small notebook he always carried. He jotted a quick line. 9:12. Carter scolds for lateness, his writing as firm as his character. He noticed a young white businessman, who'd arrived about 5 minutes late before him, had gotten only a nod from Carter. No reprimand. Carter, oblivious to Rob's composure, continued, "This court runs on order. Being late disrespects the law." He gripped the gavel on his desk, as if its presence reinforced his authority. Court clerk Helen Carter, no relation to the judge, sat at her desk, glancing at Rob with mild irritation before resuming her typing. Court guard Leroy Brown, an older black man near the door, watched with unease. In 15 years here, he'd seen this scene repeat too often. "Your Honor," Rob began, his voice low and clear. "If I may explain." Carter cut him off, hand waving dismissively. "I don't want excuses. Car trouble, traffic, family issues. None of it matters here. Your time was 9 a.m. He scanned the room, ensuring everyone heard. A young white woman, late at 9:08, sat quietly, unnoticed by Carter. The disparity was obvious to all but him. Rob stood tall, hand still on his notebook. He saw Carter's gaze fix not on his papers or professional stance, but on his white hair and slow gait, as if that's all he saw. "Perhaps a fine will remind you of punctuality," Carter declared, his tone now smug. He banged the gavel, silencing the room. "The court fines Mr. Freeman $500 for contempt. You'll pay before leaving today." A few whispers broke out, quickly hushed by Carter's glare. Rob didn't react immediately. Instead, he calmly wrote another line. 9:15, fined $500. No explanation allowed. Then looked up. His eyes held a resolve. Carter didn't notice. Rob had faced countless challenges in his career, cunning lawyers, dangerous defendants, and prejudices he'd encountered since youth. But this time felt different. From the bench, Edwin Carter didn't sense the shift in the air. His face hardened, eyes cold as he issued the ruling. Rob Freeman was fined $500 for contempt, all for being 10 minutes late. Morning sunlight streamed through high windows, casting harsh streaks across Carter's face, highlighting his smug self-righteousness. He banged the gavel again, as if to cement his power, then casually turned to the next case file. To him, the late black old man matter was done, just a small lesson in courtroom order from his 30-year reign. But Rob didn't budge. He stood at the stand, right hand on his cane, left resting lightly on his worn briefcase. His eyes bored into Carter, unwavering, as if analyzing every word, every gesture. He quietly opened his case, pulling out a small dark brown leather wallet he'd carried since his prosecutor days. Carter, distracted, muttered to Clerk Helen about the next case, his voice still tinged with arrogance. "Let's hope the next one knows time better than him." "Your Honor," Rob spoke, his low, clear voice slicing through the room. Carter looked up, annoyed, but Rob didn't let him interrupt again. He opened the wallet, withdrawing a yellowed plastic ID, bearing the gold U.S. Department of Justice seal. He held it up, letting light catch it, and said, "Before we proceed, I need to properly introduce myself for the record. I am Robert Freeman, former Assistant U.S. Attorney, Northern District of Ohio." The courtroom fell silent. The ceiling fan's hum grew deafeningly clear. Carter froze, his hand on the case file trembling slightly, his face flushing, then paling in an instant. Helen stopped typing, fingers hovering over the keys, eyes wide on Rob. Leroy Brown, near the door, couldn't hide a discreet smile. In 15 years here, he'd never seen a moment like this. A few defendants whispered, while the young white woman, who'd been late, ducked her head, avoiding attention. Rob continued, his voice calm but carrying undeniable weight. "I apologize for my tardiness this morning. I was delayed by an urgent federal matter, the Ohio trafficking case, which I believe you've heard of in the news." He paused, letting his words sink in. "I have written confirmation from the U.S. Attorney's Office, and I'm prepared to provide it to the court if needed." Carter opened his mouth, then closed it, at a loss for words. For the first time that morning, he truly saw Rob, not just the white hair or slow walk, but the professional posture, the neatly worn gray sweater, and above all, the ID in his hand. Mr. Freeman, Carter stammered, his voice shrinking, hands fumbling with papers, as if seeking an escape. "If I'd known your position, my position shouldn't matter, Your Honor," Rob interjected, his tone firm yet respectful. He set the ID on the stand, pulled his small notebook from the briefcase, and opened it. "What matters is justice applied equally. This morning, I noted some troubling things in this proceeding." He flipped a few pages, reading deliberately. 7 people arrived after 9 a.m. 3 white individuals received no reprimand from you. 2 others got light warnings. But the 2 black individuals, including myself, faced the harshest treatment. Carter's face went from pale to ashen. As a municipal judge, he knew a federal prosecutor, even retired, could spell big trouble if this escalated. He tried to regain composure. Perhaps we should discuss this privately, and of course the fine will be dropped. He signaled Helen to erase the penalty record. No, Your Honor, Rob replied, his voice now carrying decades of legal weight. Dropping the fine just because of my title would only reinforce the bias I'm addressing. I want it to stand as a chance to discuss fair treatment in this system. He scanned the room, his gaze lingering on the other defendants, some now listening intently, a few pulling out phones despite filming bans. Helen typed faster, determined to capture every word. Leroy stood taller, his eyes gleaming with quiet pride. An older black man in the audience sat up straighter, as if witnessing something he'd waited decades for. Carter, now diminished on his high bench, muttered, "You're making serious accusations, Mr. Freeman." "The evidence speaks, Your Honor," Rob replied, hand on the stand. "I've sent a report to my old office. As someone who served the law, I'm obligated to report any discrimination in the system." He paused, letting his words echo. The courtroom glowed with sunlight, like a stage where Carter's authority faded, and Rob stood firm as a guardian of justice. Carter exhaled sharply, trying to reclaim control. "I assure you this court treats everyone fairly." But his voice wavered, and no one in the room believed him anymore. Rob said nothing more, just wrote a final line, 9:20, "Carter denies bias," and closed his notebook. The courtroom of Edwin Carter fell into a heavy silence. After Rob Freeman set his notebook on the defendant's stand, Carter sat on the bench, looking smaller than ever, his hands awkwardly adjusting his thin-rimmed glasses, searching for words to regain authority. He cleared his throat, his voice now softer. "Mr. Freeman, I apologize for this unfortunate misunderstanding. We'll strike the fine from the record immediately." He gestured to Helen Carter, the clerk, to amend the file on her computer, but Rob wouldn't let him off that easily. He stood tall, hand on his cane, his deep voice ringing with certainty. "Your Honor, I refuse to have the fine removed." His words halted the room. Helen stopped typing, looking up at Rob in surprise. "I'll pay the $500, not because it's fair, but because it'll be evidence of what happened today." He pulled his leather wallet from the briefcase, withdrew a check, signed it with his resolute script, and placed it on the stand. "There's a bigger issue to address here," he added, his eyes sweeping over the other defendants, as if speaking to them too. Carter mumbled something incoherent, but no one paid attention anymore. Rob picked up his briefcase and walked out of the courtroom, his pace slow but resolute. As he left, the room's atmosphere erupted. A young law student, Emily Tran, in the back row, immediately pulled out her phone, typing a swift social media post. "Just saw something unreal at Everton Court. A former federal prosecutor, fined for being late, then exposed the judge's racial bias. #Carter bias." The post, with a blurry photo of Rob exiting, spread within minutes. Rob returned to his old Ford in the lot, setting his briefcase on the passenger seat and sliding in. He turned on NPR out of habit, but before he could listen, his phone buzzed incessantly. First, a text from Thomas Lee, his old colleague. "Your analysis this morning saved us big time. Thanks, Rob." He smiled faintly, feeling the delay had at least been worthwhile. But then came more calls from black lawyers in Everton he'd known for years. One said, "Rob, I heard about court. I've been treated like that by Carter too, but never spoke up." Another added, "We've got to do something. You've paved the way." By noon, Rob sat at his small home workspace, reviewing Thomas's email on the Ohio trafficking case. As his phone kept buzzing, he opened it to dozens of messages from strangers, lawyers, community activists, even former defendants from Carter's court. One read, "Thank you for speaking for us." He quietly noted their names in his notebook, sensing this story was growing beyond a morning in court. Meanwhile, at Everton Court, Helen Carter quietly left her desk, carrying a stack of papers she'd secretly copied, records of Carter's unfair fines over the past 6 months. She texted Rob, "I have evidence. Can we meet?" She'd stayed silent too long, but Rob's courage today spurred her to act. Across town, Daniel Park, a WTV9 reporter, stood outside the courthouse with a camera crew. He spoke into the mic. Sources confirm a former federal prosecutor was fined $500 for tardiness this morning. But what happened next has sparked a major debate about bias in our justice system. The news spread like wildfire. By afternoon, #Carter bias and #Justice for all trended on social media in Everton. Locals shared their Carter stories. One fined heavily for a minor error just for being black. Another recalling how Carter ignored their valid excuses. A young lawyer wrote, "I was there today. Freeman did what we've all wanted, but didn't dare." Rob's story wasn't just an event. It became a spark igniting long-suppressed voices. As the sun set, Rob sat in his wooden house, staring at the $500 receipt he just paid. He felt neither anger nor pride, only duty. His phone buzzed again. This time, Patricia Evans, a prominent Ohio civil rights attorney. Her voice came through the speaker. "Rob, I heard what happened. We've been documenting cases like this for years, but a former prosecutor like you speaking out changes everything. Want to talk to the press?" Rob replied briefly. "Not yet, Patricia, but I'll help if evidence is needed." He stood, walked to his bookshelf, pulled out an old law volume, and began reading. What happened this morning wasn't just a personal win, it was a call for change that Everton, and perhaps Ohio, couldn't ignore. After that fateful morning at Everton Municipal Court, the story of Rob Freeman and Judge Edwin Carter didn't end with social media posts or WTV9's evening news. By day's end, as dusk settled over Everton, Ohio's foggy streets, the Ohio Judicial Commission received Rob's formal report, a concise yet sharp document, attached with the $500 receipt and his meticulous notes from the hearing. As a former assistant U.S. attorney, Rob knew how to turn a personal incident into leverage for broader change. He sought nothing for himself, only requesting a thorough investigation into Carter's conduct. A week later, the commission's investigative team, led by Linda Hayes, began work. Linda, a seasoned investigator with 15 years' experience, sat in a small Everton meeting room, surrounded by dozens of boxes of court records from the past 5 years. She spread a large spreadsheet across the wooden table, pointing to figures her team had crunched for days. "Look here, for traffic violations, black defendants paid an average of $450 in fines, while white defendants paid $150 for the same offenses." She pushed her glasses up her forehead, her voice resolute, and that's just the tip of it. As Linda's team dug into the data, Helen Carter, the court clerk, entered the room, hands trembling slightly. She carried a small notebook she'd kept secretly for 10 years under Carter's watch. "I noticed it my first year," she said, opening the book filled with scrawled entries. How he spoke to people differently, tone, words, even the time he gave them to explain, all based on their skin color. She pointed to a page. "That day, a black man got fined $300 for being 5 minutes late, but a white lawyer, 20 minutes late, got a gentle nudge." Leroy Brown, the court guard, also spoke up. He provided a 5-page handwritten affidavit, listing hundreds of incidents he'd witnessed in 15 years. "Some days I counted how often he cut off black defendants versus white ones," Leroy wrote. "On average, black folks got interrupted 5 times more." He recalled that morning, with Rob, when Carter mocked his age without letting him explain, a scene all too familiar to Leroy. In his small wooden house, Rob continued his routine, reviewing Ohio trafficking case documents for Thomas Lee, but his little office became an impromptu hub. Young lawyers brought their Carter stories, while community activists sent long-ignored complaints. "We need to organize this," Rob told a volunteer assistant, gesturing to the paper pile on his desk. "Every story matters. Every case counts." He wasn't after fame. To him, this was a duty he couldn't shirk. The investigation didn't stop with Carter. Linda's team uncovered deeper patterns. Black women received the highest average fines. Minority defendants' cases were processed 40% faster. Payment plan requests were denied 3 times more often for minorities, and witnesses defending minority defendants were interrupted more frequently. Expanding their scope, they found 2 other Everton judges with similar behaviors. "This isn't just one judge," Linda told her team, her voice low. "It's a systemic issue." Carter was summoned for multiple interviews. In a small room, he faced Linda, his once smug demeanor gone. As she presented data, charts, stats, testimonies, he bowed his head silently. "I always prided myself on fairness," he said, his voice fading. I didn't realize." For the first time, he seemed to grasp his actions' impact, though it didn't erase the consequences. By the 3rd week's end, Linda and her team completed a 250-page report, packed with statistics, testimonies from dozens of former defendants, lawyers, and court staff, plus detailed analysis of thousands of cases. She placed it on the Judicial Commission's desk, saying, "These aren't isolated incidents. It's a pattern of bias spanning years, affecting thousands." She paused, then added, "More importantly, it shows this bias was so quiet that even those perpetrating it weren't fully aware." Meanwhile, at home, Rob sat staring at the framed $500 receipt on his desk when his phone rang unexpectedly. It was Patricia Evans, the civil rights lawyer. "The report's about to drop," she said, her tone serious. "But this is bigger than Carter, Rob. It could reshape Ohio's courts." Rob nodded, unseen. "I know. I'll help with more evidence if needed." His eyes stayed on the receipt, now a symbol not just of injustice, but a reminder of why he'd stood up, not against one man, but a system too accustomed to overlooking unfairness. And then, as Patricia predicted, things shifted. The 250-page report, by Linda Hayes and her team, didn't just expose Edwin Carter's wrongs. It shook the Ohio Judicial Commission. The numbers, testimonies, and hard evidence left no room for denial. Public outrage swelled, and Carter faced a stark choice: resign quietly, or face a public hearing before the state. He chose retreat, ending 3 decades on the bench, not with glory, but with silence, and the cost of prolonged complacency. From those ashes, a new chapter opened for Everton, where justice began to be rewritten with transparency and the resolve of people like Rob. In a surprising turn, he appeared at the first bias training session at the new Judicial Center. He stood before a room of judges and court staff, no longer in a black robe but a simple sweater. His voice trembled slightly as he said, "I never saw my own bias. I thought fairness was treating everyone the same, but I didn't examine the prejudices I carried from my past." He paused, looking at his hands. "I'm here to learn, and to help you avoid my mistakes." Rob Freeman sat in the back row, watching silently. He hadn't expected Carter to change like this. When he stood up in that courtroom 3 months ago, beside him was Helen Carter, now promoted to oversee a new court monitoring program. She whispered to Rob, "I didn't think he'd show up here, but maybe you made him think twice." Rob nodded faintly, holding his small notebook, jotting "Carter admits fault, change possible." The reforms didn't stop at one training. New rules hit Everton. All courts had to log fines, rulings, and judge behavior in detail, with data reviewed monthly by an independent panel, legal experts, community members, and civil rights activists. Leroy Brown, the longtime guard, was appointed to train new court staff. He stood before his first class, his deep voice resonating. "We're the eyes and ears of the courtroom. The days of staying quiet when we see wrong are over." At his small home workspace, Rob hung the framed $500 receipt on the wall, not to boast, but to remind himself and visitors that a small act could spark big change. Below it was a photo of him with a group of law students he now taught weekly, a class on ethics and bias in the legal system. The Everton Bar Association also launched a new reporting system for lawyers to log bias incidents. In its first month, it received over 150 reports, each thoroughly investigated. Patricia Evans visited Rob one afternoon, sitting across from him with a cup of black tea he'd brewed. "It's not just about punishing wrongdoing, Rob," she said. "It's about changing how we think about justice. Everyone entering a courthouse deserves respect, no matter their skin or circumstance." Rob nodded. "I agree. And it's spreading beyond Everton. Indeed, other Ohio cities began adopting similar reforms. Mandatory anti-bias training, regular audits of judicial rulings for racial disparities, and community oversight boards. One morning, Rob received a letter from Emily Tran, the law student who'd witnessed that day. She wrote, "You changed my path. I'm studying civil rights law because of you, and I just opened a free legal clinic at school to help those treated unfairly." Rob smiled, setting the letter on his desk. He didn't seek recognition, but those words made his efforts feel worthwhile. His phone buzzed with a message from the Ohio Judicial Commission. They wanted him to lead a new court reform committee. Rob read it, thinking back to that morning 3 months ago, when he'd entered Carter's courtroom just for a traffic ticket. One stand for right had sparked a wave of change he hadn't foreseen. He picked up the framed $500 receipt, looked at it a moment, then set it down. 3 months after Everton, Ohio's initial reforms, Rob Freeman stood in the municipal court's main hall, not as a defendant, but a speaker. Morning sunlight poured through new glass windows, illuminating a transformed space. Multilingual signs welcomed visitors. A free legal aid desk buzzed with activity, and staff greeted people with smiles. Rob held the framed $500 receipt, facing young judges and law students. He spoke, his voice low but clear. "Justice isn't just the law. It's how we treat each person who walks through these doors." A new plaque hung on the hall's wall, etched with "Justice is how we treat each person who walks through these doors." Below was the date of his clash with Edwin Carter, not specified, but every Evertonian knew. Emily Tran, now a young civil rights lawyer, sent Rob a thank you note. "You showed me change is possible. I'll carry on your work." Rob smiled, placing it on his desk in the wooden house, next to his ever-present notebook. He stepped outside, gazing at the city he'd lived in all his life. Everton was no longer the place he'd grown up in, silent with inequities. An older black man, who'd seen that day, stopped by the court, and told a staffer, "For the first time, I feel justice might actually be colorblind." Rob got a message from the Ohio Judicial Commission, asking him to lead the reform committee, but he hadn't replied. To him, legacy wasn't in titles, but in the changes he'd ignited, a wave still rippling from Everton across Ohio, and perhaps beyond. Rob Freeman's story in Everton, Ohio, mirrors a reality still present in today's U.S. racial bias and injustice in the justice system. When Rob, a 65-year-old black former federal prosecutor, was fined $500 by Judge Edwin Carter for being 10 minutes late, while a white businessman arriving late faced no penalty, it laid bare racial inequity, a problem recent U.S. Department of Justice reports show persists in many local courts. Rob's meticulous note-taking and use of the fine receipt as evidence highlight the power of strategic action, vital in a modern America, where people often use social media and documentation to fight for justice, as seen in the Black Lives Matter movement. Carter's shift from an arrogant judge to a biased training participant reminds us that even those within the system can learn and grow when faced with undeniable proof. The lesson here is in real-life America. Don't stay silent about injustice. Use the knowledge and tools at hand to drive change. Like Rob wielding his prosecutor ID and reporting to the Judicial Commission, you can start small, document incidents, escalate to authorities, or share online. More crucially, be patient and persistent like Rob, because reform doesn't come instantly. It takes time and collective will. In a diverse nation like the U.S., every voice can plant a seed for justice, if you dare to sow it. Don't forget to subscribe to follow justice stories like Rob Freeman's journey. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video, as we explore more changes shaping America.